in Global Brain Singularity, there's a paper called A Reflective Note for Dialectical Thinkers, where I sort of offer a foundational meta-ontology for the way I'm thinking within philosophy. And that sort of meta-ontology is comprised of the four thinkers you just named. And the reason why, well, even also like the tool of meta-ontology here is trying to build a structure of thought that is linked to a different thinker in different, let's say, historical epochs. So Plato for the ancient world, Hegel for the modern world, Lacan for the postmodern world, and Zizek for what I would call something like a transmodernity or something transcending modernity. Now, this as a tool, this as an exercise, I think is important for us as growing philosophers. What that means is that you don't have to identify with those four thinkers, but that you can use this tool to develop your own meta-ontology. So the principle would just be that if there's a thinker that you think is foundational in the ancient world, it doesn't have to be Plato, it could be someone totally different from a totally different tradition. And then if you can build with that thinker into the modern world, and then build with that thinker into the postmodern world, and then build with that thinker into something that's transcending the modern world, then you have something like a meta-ontology that's robust, that doesn't leave out any significant dimension of the historical process. As it relates to what I'm trying to do with that specific meta-ontology, is that I see a conversation between those four thinkers that is fundamentally connected retroactively. Meaning that, of course, Plato didn't engage with Hegel. Of course, Plato didn't engage with Lacan or Zizek. But Hegel is fundamentally engaging with Plato. And Lacan is fundamentally engaging with Hegel. And Zizek is fundamentally engaging with Lacan. And so there's a conversation there that gets developed over history. And that conversation itself makes each of those thinkers more robust retroactively. So in other words, I'm saying that Plato on his own is, to me, like even, for example, my partner's reading Plato right now. And she's introducing herself to philosophy for the first time. And she's reading Plato, and she's like, I disagree with most of the things Plato's saying. You know, her first contact with Plato is she doesn't like Plato. But then and she's saying that he's stuck in her criticism of Plato is that Plato's stuck in a philosophical fantasy. But I said, but I think that's so interesting because I told her, when you read how Lacan thinks about Plato, he's analyzing Plato as an unconscious philosophical fantasy. And so that's interesting. And so then that gets a new dimension to Plato. So I'm just trying to use that as a practical example of how when you develop a meta-ontology like this, older thinkers that might have, lost a certain edge for our time can get a new retroactive perspective based on this meta-ontological lineage that you can construct. So there's a lot of potential here. But why starting with Plato is that Plato is the foundation for what becomes Western philosophy and Western religion. And so whether or not we identify with Plato and what he actually thought, I think we have to respect the concrete results of Plato's philosophy, meaning that it had an outsized impact on what was practically being built in both the Greek world and the Roman world, and ultimately what has come to be known as the Western world. And this has had an outsized impact on mathematics, not just mathematics and geometry and logical thinking, but also sexuality and love and romance and social life. So there's a remarkable breadth and depth to Plato's thinking that seems to cover everything from mathematics to sexuality and everything in between. And that's an impressive effort, and that is an example of a foundational thinker for something like a civilizational project. Why that's an interesting intersection with Hegel is because Hegel is able, in my opinion, to historicize Plato. When we think about Plato, we usually think about the eternal ideas, we usually think about the eternal forms. And the main criticism of Platonist thinking is usually that you can get caught in eternal ideas, or you can get caught in eternal forms and basically enter into a process of disembodiment. And I think that this gets rectified with Hegel, because Hegel is able to historicize Plato. That's my claim. And with historicizing Plato, what that means is that we don't just end up in a sort of embodied relativity, but rather we have to think the eternal idea as a historical process. And that's something that I think Hegel is really useful for. And I think that's actually the core of Hegel, is that he's thinking the intersection between eternity and history. And this is a very powerful explosion that occurs and goes on to influence a lot, I think, of what we call modern philosophy, including Marx, including Nietzsche, including Heidegger, including Deleuze. And when I mention those thinkers in particular, I'm not saying that those thinkers agree with Hegel. I'm saying that those thinkers have been profoundly influenced by Hegel, and they've differentiated from Hegel, but they have nevertheless tarried with Hegel deeply. And so I think that that's important to note. Then with Lacan, what's important is that we get the psychoanalysis of philosophy. So we many times in the narratives we think that with Hegel it's almost like philosophy begins and ends, and it's almost like he's the last philosopher. With Lacan we get sort of almost like a resurrection of the philosophical project in a weird way, because we're entering into a new way of thinking about philosophy from the standpoint of the unconscious as intelligent, the unconscious that thinks and speaks. And that, so for example, just like I was giving the example of my partner saying, look, Plato's in a philosophical fantasy. This doesn't have any implications for real political problems. And Lacan would say, well, precisely, there's the unconscious at work at the very foundation of philosophy itself. And so this is a very useful activity. And Lacan himself does this throughout his career. He psychoanalyzes Descartes and saying that, like, for example, at the ground of Cartesian rationality, you have this explosion of madness, right? Like, and this explosion of madness where Descartes is doubting everything, and he's actually playing with the idea that he's been deceived by God, right? And so there's this explosion of insanity at the ground of what we consider to be a very rational cognitive process. And so Lacan's doing this all the time. And then finally with Zizek, and I think that before I close, I think it's very important that if you do engage this sort of meta-ontological project, or if you're interested in philosophy in general, it's very important to be in contact with a living philosopher. Don't just engage with dead philosophers. It's very important to have some contact with a living philosopher. And I think the reason why that's important is because philosophy is almost like eternity refreshing itself in every historical generation. So every historical generation has to refresh its thought of the absolute. And I think that for me, Zizek spoke to me in a deep way. And Zizek, his performativity spoke to me, and also the way in which he engaged history spoke to me. And the way I've come to understand that is that I see Zizek as an explosion in the aftermath of the Cold War. So the Cold War ends, and we find ourselves no longer in a battle between capitalism and communism. but in a universal capitalism. And the common doxa is that we've transcended world historical ideological conflict. The main ideological conflict between capitalism and communism is over. And now we can just have a rational, liberal, secular society. But Zizek is saying ideology is here even more pervasive than ever. And ideology functions unconsciously to bring in the Lacanian dimension, the psychoanalytic dimension, and that we enjoy our ideology, meaning that people like their ideology. When we usually say, like, we usually are critical of ideology, we're usually saying that ideology is something to be deconstructed. But Zizek is saying even the deconstructionists, they love their ideology. They love the deconstructive ideology. They don't want to let that go, right? So there's something really profound in that gesture. And also Zizek has always used, and I think this is a very important thing to develop as a thinker, Zizek has always engaged world historical crisis. And he has thought with world historical crisis. So, for example, when 9/11 occurred, he was the first person to write a big book about it. When the 2008 financial collapse happened, he was writing a book about it. When coronavirus occurred, he was writing a book about it. So when world historical crisis breaks out, that's the time for philosophy to get its hands dirty, so to speak. And that's a really important dimension, which I think Ivy League, elite, university philosophy sometimes takes a distance from. Like, we're just in the idea, reflecting on Plato's dialogues. We don't have time to think about coronavirus. We don't have time to think about 9/11. We don't have time to think about the 2008 financial crisis. I think, no. I think we need to think about these dimensions. And what is philosophy good for if it's not thinking about these world historical ruptures, which, to bring the point full circle, is that precisely those crises can't be predicted by science. They disrupt normal processes. They disrupt our world. Nobody knew that coronavirus was going to happen. Nobody knew that 9/11 was going to happen. These are things that disturb us. They invade us almost. So I think that's where philosophy becomes most actual and most real.
Yeah, I really appreciate this bit that you all this that you shared, and there's so many pieces there. I want to just kind of double tap on a couple of things and kind of scaffold that. You spoke about Plato kind of being this foundational thinker and foundational for Western philosophy and religion, and then Hegel kind of comes in and he takes Plato's idea of the eternal and turns them into process. Like he puts them into history. How do these ideas play out in history? And and then you mentioned Lacan, psychoanalyzing past philosophers. Like, what was happening in each of these philosophers' minds as they're like coming to these thoughts and these ideas. And then Zizek, he's somebody who also is very engaged in history. And, the thing you spoke about, which is really interesting, that he will talk about world historical crisis and actually engage with what is really important, where a lot of times, like, academic philosophy is like, it's just philosophizing and not thinking about what's happening. I think what else is really interesting, and I've thought about this before, how what's really interesting about philosophy is that you have people that came before us and that have, lived 100 years, 80 years, 70 years, and they've spent that life thinking deeply about things and then writing them down. And now we have all their thoughts. So now we're kind of getting an advantage in a sense that there's been all these people that came before us that spent hours and years and decades thinking about these things, and we could kind of build on that. But the piece that you also say is that you can take different ideas and kind of see, you kind of filter one thinker through another thinker's ideas, and there's just this kind of like almost like fractal building on philosophies. And yeah, it's the other piece that you said that's I don't think I've heard before, but was really interesting is that you need to be in contact with a living philosopher. So like, Plato, Hegel, and Lacan, they're dead. Zizek is a modern day philosopher that's still alive right now. A lot of times people say that, you should only read old books, because they stood the test of time. But it's interesting how you bring in this piece. Like, no, there's something about somebody living in these days and times dealing with what's happening now that's also important to this kind of philosophical process.